Jason's sneakers scuffed against the frosted concrete path winding through the park. The crisp autumn air tugged at the edges of his too thin jacket, and his breath curled into soft clouds with every step. 16 and lanky, Jason wandered aimlessly, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The park was his escape, a place where he could breathe away from the cramped apartment he shared with his mom. She worked long shifts at the diner, leaving Jason to his own devices most afternoons. The park was nearly empty that day, its benches speckled with golden leaves that clung stubbornly to the season's last moments. Jason stuffed his hands into his pockets, keeping his head down. He wasn't used to looking for company, not here, not anywhere. As he passed the fountain, a figure caught his eye. An elderly man sat on a weathered bench, bundled in a gray tweed jacket and a flat cap. By his side rested a cane with an intricately carved handle, and on his lap was a sketch pad. The man's hand moved steadily, his pencil gliding across the page with an ease that mesmerized Jason. He slowed his steps, curiosity pulling him closer. Stopping to watch, "Are you?" the man said suddenly, his voice warm but sharp enough to startle Jason. "Well, come closer. I won't charge for the view." Jason hesitated. The man didn't look up, but his lips curved into a faint smile. Reluctantly, Jason stepped closer, peering over the man's shoulder. The sketch was a half-finished rendering of the fountain. It wasn't polished, but there was something alive about it, the way the lines curved, the shadows played. Jason didn't know much about art, but he couldn't look away. "It's good," Jason said quietly. "Good," he says, the man replied, chuckling. "Not exactly glowing praise, but I'll take it. What's your name, kid?" "Jason." "Well, Jason, I'm Mr. Whitaker." He finally looked up, his pale blue eyes crinkling as he offered a gnarled hand. Jason shook it, the man's grip surprisingly firm. "You're really good at that. Years of practice. Are you an artist?" Jason shook his head. "No, I can't draw." "That's so," Mr. Whitaker said, raising a bushy eyebrow. "Shame. The world needs more people who notice the little things. Like this fountain, most folks walk right past it, but you stopped. That's a start." Jason shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Mr. Whitaker went back to his sketch, humming softly to himself. Jason lingered, watching the fountain come to life under the pencil's strokes. When the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, Jason glanced at the time. "I should go." "Suit yourself," Mr. Whitaker said, not looking up. "See you around, Jason." Jason nodded, slinging his backpack higher as he walked away. He told himself he might not come back, but something about the old man stuck with him. It was as if, for a brief moment, someone had really seen him, and it wasn't something Jason was used to feeling. The next day, Jason found himself back at the park, though he hadn't planned to go. He told himself it was just habit, a place to clear his head. But as he approached the fountain, his eyes sought the weathered bench without meaning to. There, just as he'd left him, sat Mr. Whitaker, sketchpad on his lap, pencil in hand. "Back again. Are you?" Mr. Whitaker asked, glancing up with a knowing smile. Jason shrugged, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Yeah, I guess." "I guess," he says, Mr. Whitaker replied, shaking his head in mock disapproval. "Sit down already. You're making me nervous, looming like that." Jason hesitated, but only for a moment. He perched on the far edge of the bench, keeping his distance. Mr. Whitaker returned to his sketch, muttering under his breath about shadows and proportions. Jason watched in silence, mesmerized by the way the drawing unfolded. "What's it supposed to be?" Jason finally asked. Mr. Whitaker paused, raising an eyebrow. "Supposed to be? It's not supposed to be anything. It's just what I see." Jason frowned, trying to understand. "But it's not perfect." "Of course not," Mr. Whitaker said, laughing. "Perfection's boring. The world's messy, kid. That's what makes it worth drawing." Jason didn't have a response for that, so he stayed quiet. For the next hour they sat in companionable silence, the only sounds the scratch of pencil on paper and the occasional rustle of leaves. As the sunlight began to fade, Mr. Whitaker leaned back, examining his sketch. "Good enough for today," he said, nodding in satisfaction. He glanced at Jason, who was still watching intently. "You should give it a try sometime." "I told you, I can't draw." "And I told you, that's a shame. But you never know until you try." Jason snorted, shaking his head. Maybe is better than I can't," Mr. Whitaker said with a grin. Jason stood to leave, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "See you tomorrow, maybe." "You'll be back," Mr. Whitaker said with a wave. "They always come back." Jason rolled his eyes, but he was smiling as he walked away. The park felt different now, not just a place to be alone, but somewhere he could breathe a little easier. The next week, Jason found himself visiting the park nearly every day. Each time Mr. Whitaker was there, sketchpad in hand, his cane leaning against the bench. They talked more as the days passed, their conversations meandering like the park's winding paths. Jason learned that Mr. Whitaker had been an artist all his life, traveling with his late wife to paint and sketch in cities he described with a wistful smile. "She was the real artist," Mr. Whitaker said one afternoon, his voice softer than usual. "I just tagged along with a pencil and some paper." Jason frowned. "But you're good." "She was better," Mr. Whitaker replied simply, his blue eyes distant. "She saw the beauty in things before anyone else could." Jason didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed quiet. But he thought about it long after he left the park that day. By the end of the week, Mr. Whitaker brought an extra sketchpad to their usual bench. He handed it to Jason without a word, along with a pencil. Jason stared at it like it was a foreign object. "What's this for?" he asked. "For drawing," Mr. Whitaker replied, as though it were obvious. "Go on, give it a shot." "I told you, I'm not." "Not an artist, I know," Mr. Whitaker interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "Just try. For me." Jason sighed, but he opened the sketchpad and took the pencil. For the first time, he tried to put something on paper. His lines were shaky, his proportions all wrong, and his shading almost non-existent. When he looked at the mess he'd made, he flushed with embarrassment. "It's terrible," he muttered, closing the sketchpad quickly. "It's a start," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice calm. "And that's all that matters." Jason glanced at him, unsure whether to believe him. But when Mr. Whitaker smiled, the doubt in Jason's chest loosened just a little. The days turned colder, and the leaves blanketing the park transformed from vibrant orange to brittle brown. Jason found himself drawn to the bench more often than not, his reluctance to try sketching gradually giving way to quiet determination. Each day, Mr. Whitaker offered gentle critiques and occasional praise, guiding Jason's unsteady hand with patience. "Look at the light, not just the object," Mr. Whitaker said one afternoon, gesturing toward the fountain. "See how the shadows curve around it, how the sunlight gives it depth." Jason squinted, nodding slowly. He adjusted his pencil strokes, his fingers smudged with graphite. His sketch wasn't perfect, far from it, but he felt a flicker of pride in the progress he was making. "You're getting the hang of it," Mr. Whitaker said with a smile. Jason smiled back, the compliment warming him against the brisk wind. "Thanks." Their afternoons grew into a rhythm, sketching, talking, and sometimes just sitting quietly as the park bustled around them. Jason found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told Mr. Whitaker about his mother, how hard she worked to keep them afloat, and how he often felt like a burden. "She's proud of you, you know," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice steady. "Mothers don't say it enough, but they are." Jason shrugged, staring at his sketchpad. "I don't know. She's tired all the time. And I'm just here." "You're more than just here, Jason," Mr. Whitaker said firmly. "You've got dreams, don't you?" Jason hesitated. "I guess. I want to write, but it feels stupid." Like something other kids get to do. Not me. Mr. Whitaker tapped his cane against the ground thoughtfully. Why not you? You've got stories in you, I can tell. Don't let the world convince you otherwise. Jason didn't respond, but those words settled deep within him. One especially cold afternoon, Jason arrived at the bench to find Mr. Whitaker waiting with a steaming thermos and 2 mugs. Hot tea, Mr. Whitaker said, pouring a cup for Jason. Warms the hands and the spirit. Jason took the mug gratefully, savoring the spiced aroma. Thanks. I needed this. You're welcome. Now let me ask you something, Mr. Whitaker said, leaning forward slightly. What's your favorite story you've ever written? Jason blinked. I don't know, I haven't written much. Just stuff in my notebook. Doesn't matter. Pick one. Jason thought for a moment, then described a short story he'd written about a boy who finds a mysterious key that leads to a hidden garden. He spoke hesitantly at first, but as he got into the details, his voice grew stronger. Mr. Whitaker listened intently, nodding along. When Jason finished, he grinned. Sounds like a tale worth telling. Jason flushed, warmth blooming in his chest. You really think so? Of course, Mr. Whitaker said. But you've got to keep writing. Stories don't finish themselves. As the days passed, Jason felt something shift within him. He began to write more in his battered notebook, filling its pages with sketches, fragments of dialogue, and half-formed ideas. At school, he faced the usual teasing from classmates about his worn clothes and duct-taped sneakers, but it stung less now. He carried the quiet strength of Mr. Whitaker's belief in him. At home, things didn't magically improve. His mother still came home exhausted, her hands red and raw from scrubbing dishes at the diner. But when Jason showed her one of his sketches one evening, her tired eyes lit up with pride. That's beautiful. Jason, she said, tracing the lines of the fountain he had drawn. You're talented. Jason's heart swelled. He didn't need more than that. One day, as Jason prepared to leave the park, Mr. Whitaker handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Jason asked, frowning. Open it at home, Mr. Whitaker said, a twinkle in his eye. Think of it as a little nudge forward. When Jason unwrapped it later that evening, he found a set of colored pencils, neatly arranged in a tin case. Tears pricked his eyes. It wasn't just a gift, it was a gesture of belief. A reminder that someone saw his potential. As Jason lay in bed that night, the tin held tightly in his hands, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Winter descended on the town with a quiet ferocity, covering the park in a thin layer of frost. Jason arrived at the bench each day bundled in his worn jacket and the thick scarf Mr. Whitaker had given him earlier in the season. The old man greeted him with his usual nod, though Jason noticed that his movements had grown slower, his voice softer. Morning, Kid, Mr. Whitaker said one particularly cold afternoon, his breath curling in the icy air. Still sticking with the drawing? Jason nodded, holding up his sketch pad. He had drawn a tree from across the park, its bare branches arching into the gray sky. The proportions were still off, and the shading needed work, but it was better than anything he had managed weeks ago. You're getting better, Mr. Whitaker said, examining the sketch. It's got life in it now. Jason beamed, tucking the pad back into his bag. Thanks. I've been practicing. Good. Don't stop, Mr. Whitaker said. He leaned back, his cane resting against his knee. How's the writing coming along? Jason hesitated. I've been writing more. It's just. Sometimes it feels like it's not good enough. Like, what's the point? Mr. Whitaker's gaze was steady. The point, Jason, is that you're doing it. That's what matters. The world's full of people who never even try. Jason nodded, his chest tight with gratitude. He didn't say it aloud, but he was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, Mr. Whitaker was right. One particularly snowy evening, Jason noticed that Mr. Whitaker seemed unusually quiet. His usual teasing remarks were absent, and his focus on the sketchpad was uncharacteristically subdued. "You okay?" Jason asked, frowning. Mr. Whitaker smiled faintly. "Just tired, kid. Old bones and cold weather don't mix well." Jason wasn't convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he spent the afternoon drawing alongside Mr. Whitaker, the silence between them as comforting as their conversations. Before Jason left, Mr. Whitaker handed him a small wooden box, its lid intricately carved with swirling patterns. "What's this?" Jason asked, turning it over in his hands. "Something for safekeeping," Mr. Whitaker said. "But promise me you won't open it until it feels like the right time." Jason frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean, the right time?" "You'll know," Mr. Whitaker said with a cryptic smile. Reluctantly, Jason nodded. "Okay, I promise." He placed the box on his shelf that evening, next to his sketchpad and the tin of colored pencils. The mystery of it gnawed at him, but his promise held firm. The following week, Jason arrived at the park to find the bench empty. The usual sight of Mr. Whitaker sketching by the fountain was conspicuously absent. Jason told himself the old man must have stayed home because of the cold, but when another day passed without him, Jason felt a knot of unease forming in his stomach. On the third day, Jason's mother came home from work, her face drawn with an unfamiliar sadness. "Jason," she said gently, "I need to tell you something. Your friend from the park, Mr. Whitaker, he passed away." The words struck Jason like a blow. "What? How?" "He was old, sweetheart," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It sounds like he went peacefully." Jason sank onto the couch, his thoughts spinning. Mr. Whitaker had been more than a friend, he'd been a lifeline, a mentor, a reminder that someone believed in him. And now he was gone. That night, Jason sat in his room, staring at the wooden box. His promise echoed in his mind, but something about the moment felt heavy with meaning. Carefully, he reached for it and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of folded papers tied with a ribbon, along with a handwritten note. Jason unfolded the note first, his hands trembling. "Jason, you've got a rare gift and I hope you never doubt it. I've left you a little something to help you follow your dreams. Use it well and always remember kindness makes the world brighter. Your friend." "Your friend, Mr. Whitaker." Jason's breath caught as he unfolded the papers. They were sketches, scenes from the park he recognized instantly. The fountain, the sprawling oak tree, even Jason himself, drawn with the same careful attention Mr. Whitaker gave everything. Each drawing was accompanied by small handwritten notes. "The boy has a sharp eye. He'll go far if he believes in himself. Kindness radiates from the small things he does without realizing it. A promising writer in the making." Beneath the sketches was a sealed envelope marked, "For Jason's future." Jason opened it with shaking fingers and found a check for $10,000. For a moment he could only stare, overwhelmed by the enormity of the gesture. His throat tightened as tears welled in his eyes. Mr. Whitaker had believed in him so deeply, he had planned for a future Jason had barely dared to imagine. Jason spent the next few days wrestling with the mix of emotions Mr. Whitaker's gift had stirred in him. He missed the old man fiercely, their quiet conversations, the way he could make the world seem less overwhelming. At the same time, Jason felt a sense of purpose blooming within him, as though Mr. Whitaker's belief had sparked something he couldn't ignore. He showed the letter and check to his mother one evening. Her eyes filled with tears as she read the note, and she hugged Jason tightly. "He must have cared about you so much," she said softly. "What are you going to do with it?" Jason thought about the question long after his mother had gone to bed. The answer came to him as he sat by the wooden box, tracing his fingers over its carved lid. The money would help him get to college, pursue his dream of writing, and maybe one day create something that would make Mr. Whitaker proud. The following weekend, Jason decided he wanted to do something special to honor Mr. Whitaker. With his mother's help, he organized a small gathering at the park. He borrowed easels from the school and displayed the sketches Mr. Whitaker had left him, along with a few of his own. Jason wasn't sure how many people would come, but he felt it was important to try. To his surprise, the park was filled with more people than he'd imagined. Neighbors, park regulars, and even a few of Jason's classmates showed up, drawn by the flyers he'd posted. Many shared stories about Mr. Whitaker, how he'd sketched their children, shared quiet words of encouragement, or simply greeted them with a kind smile. An elderly woman approached Jason, her eyes misty, as she looked at one of Mr. Whitaker's sketches. "He sketched me and my late husband years ago," she said. "It's still hanging in my living room. He had a gift for seeing people." Jason smiled, his chest tight with emotion. He did. When the gathering quieted, Jason stood near the bench where he and Mr. Whitaker had spent so many afternoons. With a deep breath, he began to speak. Mr. Whitaker was more than an artist, he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. He was someone who believed in people, especially when they didn't believe in themselves. "He changed my life just by being kind, and I think he did the same for so many of us." He gestured toward the sketches. "These drawings are a reminder of the way he saw the world, with patience, care, and hope. I hope we can all carry a little of that with us." As Jason finished, a warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. It felt, in some intangible way, like Mr. Whitaker was there, listening. Months later, Jason took the first steps toward making his dreams a reality. He used part of the money to apply for writing programs at colleges he'd once thought were out of reach. When acceptance letters arrived, he felt a spark of pride he hadn't known was possible. During his first semester, Jason wrote an essay about his friendship with Mr. Whitaker. He submitted it to a writing contest, not for the prize but to share the story of the man who had changed his life. To Jason's surprise, the essay won, earning him recognition and a modest scholarship. With part of the prize money, Jason commissioned a small bronze plaque for the bench where they had shared so many afternoons. He worked with the city to have it installed beneath the bench, and when it was done, he visited the park to see it for himself. The plaque read, "In memory of Arthur Whitaker, a friend, an artist, and a believer in kindness. Kindness makes the world brighter." Jason sat on the bench for a while that day, his sketchpad open on his lap. He didn't draw or write, but he felt a quiet peace settle over him. Years later, Jason became a writer, his stories filled with themes of resilience, hope, and the power of small acts of kindness. His books reached readers across the world, but Jason never forgot where it all began. He often returned to the park, sketchpad in hand, sitting on the bench to reflect or share his craft with others. One sunny afternoon, a young boy approached him, clutching a notebook with tentative hands. "Excuse me," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you a writer?" Jason smiled, gesturing for the boy to sit beside him. "I am. Do you write too?" "I want to," the boy said, his cheeks flushing. "But I'm not sure if I'm any good." Jason pulled a pencil from his bag, handing it to the boy with a knowing smile. "Good doesn't matter. What matters is trying." As the boy began to scribble, Jason felt a familiar warmth in his chest. The kindness Mr. Whitaker had shown him so long ago wasn't just a memory, it was alive, growing with each act of encouragement, every pencil stroke, every word shared. It was a legacy, continuing one connection at a time.